So we are looking at what many are calling the defining geopolitical rivalry of our time.
It really is.
This race between China and the United States, but it's not a race for, land or resources in the traditional sense. It's a race for technological supremacy.
Exactly. And the goal for Beijing is explicit. Unseat the United States as the world's leading technological superpower by the middle of this century.
And this competition, this race has completely upended how the U.S. thinks about global economic policy.
Oh, no, completely. For decades, the mantra was simple, wasn't it? It was globalization, free trade, efficiency. All of that came first.
Right.
Now, the entire strategy is built around aggressive industrial policy and very targeted export controls. And everything is viewed, first and foremost, through a national security lens, not a purely economic one.
That's what our deep dive is all about today. We're focused completely on this strategic American response, the architecture of these new techno-economic walls being built.
Yeah.
And if you really want to understand who is waging this war, who is designing it, you have to look straight at National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
He is absolutely the intellectual architect of this entire shift.
He is. He's the one who successfully argued that U.S. foreign policy had to pivot, away from its decades-long focus on counterterrorism and focus with laser-like intensity on great power technological competition.
And it was Sullivan who came up with the guiding metaphor for the whole U.S. approach. It's a phrase you hear everywhere in policy circles now, but it's still incredibly controversial when you get down to the details.
That famous metaphor, building a high fence around a small yard.
That's the one. And on paper, the mission sounds, well, elegant. It sounds clean. You wall off the truly critical technologies, that's your small yard, the things with significant military or strategic potential.
And then you let everything else continue. Broader beneficial trade with China can just keep happening outside that fence. It sounds precise, surgical even.
Exactly. It sounds like a way to maintain a technological lead without, completely crashing the global economy.
But the challenge, and this is what our sources from economists, security experts, and policymakers are all pointing to, is that drawing that line, actually defining the yard, is turning out to be an almost impossible task.
And that's because the foundational shift here is so profound. Industrial policy, we're talking about subsidies, tax incentives, trade barriers. It's just not about economic optimization anymore. It's now fundamentally linked to national security.
That linkage is everything.
It is. The scholar Jonathan Pelson, he summed it up perfectly when he was describing Beijing's strategy. He said China's industrial policy isn't about simple trade. It's much closer to national security by other means.
And now the U.S. has basically adopted that same thinking, the recognition that economic leverage is now the primary weapon of national power.
Which means we're in a whole new kind of great power competition. The battlefield is the supply chain. The targets are these little technological nodes. And the most powerful weapon isn't a general, it's a regulator at the U.S. Commerce Department wielding a piece of legislation.
It's a completely different kind of warfare.
And what's really fascinating, and frankly a little bit scary, is that the U.S. government now has this huge amount of discretion under laws like the Export Control Reform Act or ECRA. They can define national security almost however they want.
So it's not just about military applications anymore.
Not at all. The interpretation could potentially include things like maintaining economic prosperity or just ensuring supply chain resilience.
And that kind of broad discretion, it's a double-edged sword, isn't it? It gives the U.S. the power to act fast, which is good.
But it also massively increases the risk of just overreach, of accidentally triggering this chaotic runaway decoupling where the fence just keeps getting bigger and bigger until it's a wall around the entire economy.
And that's the tension we're going to explore today, this desire for a surgical strike versus the messy reality of a globally entangled economy.
Okay, so let's unpack this small yard. If the whole idea is to define and protect the most critical assets, what is the single most valuable thing they are trying to wall off? It has to be semiconductors.
It is absolutely semiconductors. That is the core focus. It's the beating heart of the small yard. The strategy is all about preventing China from either obtaining or, more importantly, producing advanced chips.
And it's not just about denying them the final product, the chip itself.
No, not at all. It's about strategically targeting the entire semiconductor ecosystem. You have to go after the key production choke points where the U.S. and its core allies hold this unique, almost monopolistic dominance.
And the American strategy here is actually pretty clever because it's two-pronged. It's both defensive and offensive.
Precisely. The Biden administration is using carrots and sticks at the same time. The carrot is the CHPS and Science Act. That's a massive investment in domestic research and domestic manufacturing, rebuilding the foundation at home.
Right. Mike Schmidt, who is the former director of the THPS program office, he argued that the U.S. needs this investment to sustain demand for at least two related manufacturing ecosystems. He wanted to actively, and I'm quoting here, sustain and grow leading process technology in the United States. They're trying to reverse decades of outsourcing.
So that's the carrot.
Yeah.
And the stick is these simultaneous sweeping export restrictions that define exactly what counts as advanced technology and is therefore banned for export to China.
Yeah.
This is where the technical details become state policy.
Yes. And the Department of Commerce got incredibly specific with the technological thresholds.
Yeah.
They were intensely precise.
What kind of specs are we talking about?
For logic chips, they targeted the manufacturing equipment needed for anything at 14 nanometers or 16 nanometers or, more advanced processes.
Yeah.
For G-memory chips, which are your essential short-term data access chips, the line was drawn at an 18 nanometer half pitch or more advanced. And for NAND memory, your long-term storage, the control was set at 144 layers or more.
Those numbers are so specific. Can you use a quick analogy for a listener? What's the practical difference between a controlled 14-nanometer chip process and what the U.S. can currently produce, which is closer to, 3 nanometers? Why do those few nanometers matter so much for military or AI power?
It's the difference between having a fundamental capability and having overwhelming dominance. Think of it this way. A 14-nanometer chip is like a big, reliable, powerful delivery truck. It gets the job done, it moves goods.
Okay, I'm with you.
A 3-nanometer chip is a magnetic levitation high-speed train. It moves exponentially more goods, way faster, using a fraction of the energy, and it runs on a much more sophisticated network.
So in AI terms, that translates to?
Yeah. It translates directly to the scale of the models you can train, the complexity of the weapon systems you can run. We're talking autonomous drones, hypersonic missiles, quantum computing. By denying China the ability to manufacture below that 14-nanometer line, you are effectively keeping them operating with older, slower machinery while the U.S. and its allies are advancing to jets and rockets.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting because controlling the end product, the chip, that's always hard. They're tiny, they're easy to smuggle, and we'll get into that later.
Right.
The truly effective move is to control the means of production, the technology that makes the chips, the semiconductor manufacturing equipment, or SME.
That is the true choke point. That is the real high fence. SME is the absolute foundation of the entire advanced technology stack. The U.S. understands this perfectly. Their ability to regulate exports of advanced AI chips is completely dependent on China not being able to just make those chips itself.
If China can build the factory, the U.S. controls basically evaporate.
Exactly. If they can get the equipment, the game is over.
And the SME industry is incredibly concentrated globally, which gives the U.S. and its allies this immense, though maybe temporary, leverage.
The concentration is just staggering, and it's deeply geopolitical. You have 5 companies. 3 are American Applied Materials, KLA, and Lam Research. Then you have 2 key allies, ASML from the Netherlands and Tokyo Electron from Japan.
And together they control most of the market.
Together they hold something like 80 to 85% of the entire global SME market. This is where the U.S. strategy lives or dies. If you can control that input machinery, you control who gets to even play in the advanced manufacturing game.
We have to talk about the one machine that best illustrates this technological barrier, the Extreme Ultraviolet Lithography Scanner, the EUV machine. It's made only by ASML in the Netherlands.
Oh, yeah.
And the descriptions we have of it, it doesn't sound like a machine. It sounds like something from a high-tech science fiction novel.
It really does. The EUV scanner is widely described as the single most complex machine that humans have ever put into serial production. It just perfectly illustrates the sheer mind-boggling difficulty China faces in trying to indigenize this stuff.
It's huge,
right? It's the size of a double-decker bus, weighs hundreds of thousands of pounds, and it's assembled from components sourced from thousands of unique suppliers all over the world.
And the operational details? This is where the physics just seems to demand a miracle. Tell us about the controlled lightning storm happening inside of it.
Right. So to generate the light it needs, extreme ultraviolet light, which has a much shorter wavelength than normal light. The machine operates in a near-perfect vacuum chamber.
Okay.
Inside, it uses a high-energy laser that fires an incredible 50,000 times per second.
50,000 times.
A second.
A second. And it's targeting these tiny droplets of molten tin. Each droplet is about 1/4 the width of a human hair.
Firing a laser at a target that small that many times a second is it's hard to comprehend. It is. And when the laser hits the tin, it vaporizes it into a microplasma, and that plasma emits the extreme ultraviolet light needed to etch the circuit patterns. That is the controlled lightning storm. It's this incredibly delicate but also incredibly violent process happening constantly.
But the part that completely defies human scale for me is the precision of the mirrors that have to guide that light.
They are beyond human comprehension. The light doesn't pass through glass lenses like in a normal camera. It has to bounce off a series of highly polished mirrors made by Zeiss in Germany. And these mirrors have to be so perfect that if you scaled one up to the size of the entire Earth,
The whole planet.
the largest imperfection on its surface would be less than 2 centimeters tall. They are, quite literally, the smoothest objects ever created by humanity.
And this light, guided by these perfect mirrors, is then used to imprint circuits onto silicon wafers. Wafers that are accelerating faster than a jet fighter during takeoff.
With a placement precision that cannot vary by more than 2 or 3 atoms.
It's just incredible.
And that's the core of the choke point. And remember, lithography is just one step in the factory. You also have advanced plasma etch machines, which use ionized gases hotter than the surface of the sun to carve these 3D structures into the silicon. And they have to stop at the exact right atomic layer across billions of features on one chip.
Or the deposition tools that build up films one atomic layer at a time.
Exactly. Every single piece of equipment operates at the absolute edge of known physics.
So our sources refer to these advanced chips as the lifeblood of modern high-stakes technology. By controlling the foundation, this impossibly sophisticated SME, the U.S. hopes they can deny China the ability to innovate in those critical military domains. Advanced AI, quantum computing, autonomous weapons, hypersonic systems. The technological moat is massive.
It is, but the question is, how long can they maintain it?
This strategy of denying technology to a rival power, it isn't new.
Yeah.
This entire effort feels very much like a modern version of the Cold War effort, COCOM, the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, which targeted the Soviet bloc.
The parallel isn't just academic. It's a central point of reference for today's policymakers. The U.S. efforts against the Soviets and against China are, as one source put it, strikingly similar in their basic concept. The goal is to restrict strategically significant dual-use goods from reaching the adversary to maintain a qualitative military edge.
But the effectiveness of COCOM is, well, it's often debated. I mean, if the goal was to stop the Soviet Union from becoming a military peer, it pretty clearly failed.
And that's a key lesson we have to absorb when we're judging the current strategy. If the maximalist goal of COCOM was a failure, the minimalist goal, just maintaining a technological lead, was, a bit more effective.
How much more effective?
Experts estimate that COCOM plausibly contributed to frustrating and delaying Soviet technological progress, particularly in electronics. And they put a number on it. About 2 to 5 years.
2 to 5 years, that's a delay, not a denial. And it's a very short time frame in a rivalry that lasts for decades. That suggests the current strategy, which seems to aim for outright denial, has an even higher bar for success.
Precisely. And the consensus from our sources is that trying this denial strategy against China is fundamentally and structurally harder now than it ever was against the USSR.
Why is that? What are the main reasons? It really comes down to economic centrality, doesn't it?
That is the single greatest difference. The Soviet Union was, for the most part, operating outside the liberal world economy. It was behind its own iron curtain. China, on the other hand, is deeply, and I would argue irrevocably, embedded in the global economy. It's the world's factory, and it's the world's largest consumer market. That changes everything for getting allies on board.
Because China isn't just a market. For many of the key allies the U.S. needs to enforce this fence, China is the dominant global market.
That is the central problem. China is the #1 trading partner for these vital technology suppliers. We're talking Germany, Japan, South Korea, and of course Taiwan. This creates intense allied reluctance to fully back the U.S. controls.
You have tech execs saying it all the time.
They do. They'll say, often privately, there's no alternative for the China market. If you force a company like ASML or Samsung to just walk away from that massive source of revenue, You risk crippling their own ability to reinvest and maintain their technological lead over China in the long run.
And we saw this reluctance play out immediately, didn't we? When the Biden administration first imposed these sweeping restrictions, they had to grant massive carve-outs.
They absolutely did. The U.S. had to grant these waivers to giants like SK Hynix, Samsung, and TSMC, basically allowing them to continue some of their advanced operations in China.
Which seems to defeat the purpose.
Well, the Wall Street Journal noted that these waivers were a sober recognition by U.S. authorities that isolating China is just exponentially more difficult than they thought. It wasn't just a regulatory inconvenience, it was a political necessity to keep these core allies on board, even if it meant some technology was still leaking through.
I remember reading a really stark quote from a South Korean chairman about this.
He put it so bluntly. He said, "To give up the large market that is China, we won't be able to recover." That fear is the constant structural weakness in Jake Sullivan's high fence strategy. If the enforcement hurts your allies more than it hurts your target, the whole alliance just starts to crumble.
And on top of that, unlike the Soviet Union, China has a very powerful retaliation toolkit. It's rooted in its dominance over essential raw materials, and it gives them the ability to inflict pain on the global supply chain, like instantly.
This is the second huge hurdle that just didn't exist during the Cold War.
Yeah.
China supplies most of the world's critical minerals. We're talking about gallium, germanium, antimony, graphite, rare earths.
The building blocks of modern tech.
Absolutely. And for many of these, China supplies 50% or more of all U.S. and European imports.
And they're not afraid to use that leverage when they feel cornered.
Not at all. We've seen them repeatedly restrict exports of these minerals as a direct retaliation against U.S. export controls. And the fear of this targeted retaliation is palpable, especially in Europe. In Germany, for example, the main argument against taking a tougher line on tech decoupling is the open acknowledgement that there is a high risk of retaliation from Beijing. Retaliation that could cripple their own key manufacturing sectors, like cars or machinery.
So, to sum it up, we don't have that unified military front like we did during the Cold War, where NATO allies were united against the USSR. Now, our key partners prioritize their economic ties with Beijing, and they risk losing access to a huge market and critical inputs if they align too closely with Washington. The whole context is just vastly less favorable for cooperation.
Right. The fence is only as high as the willingness of your weakest supplier to participate. And China's leverage over trade and raw materials is a constant incentive for your allies to lower their section of that fence.
You know, the big lesson from COCOM was that what starts as a small yard has a tendency to expand to this vast, sprawling complex of restrictions. It does. Cold War leaders also said they wanted a surgical, scalpel approach. I think the Assistant Commerce Secretary, Thea Rosman-Kendler, even called the current effort that. But history shows the yard almost inevitably grows, and it threatens to pull everything into the national security domain.
It does, and the exact same pressures that drove COCOM's expansion are fully operational today against China. There are, I would say, 3 structural reasons why this small yard strategy is constantly under pressure to grow into a much larger yard, risking that chaotic overreach we talked about and just blurring the lines between economic policy and defense.
Okay, let's start with the factor that just complicates every single decision. Civil-military fusion, or MCF.
MCF is the cornerstone of Xi Jinping's entire strategy. The goal is to completely integrate China's civilian and military technological domains to strengthen the PLA's power.
So if commercial tech underpins military power, the dual-use nature of modern technology makes these selective controls almost impossible.
It does. If a piece of commercial AI software helps a factory run more efficiently, it probably also helps the PLA refine its targeting systems or conduct more sophisticated intelligence analysis.
So if commercial technology is fundamentally strategic, then there's almost nothing left that's truly non-strategic. And the small yard, by definition, has to grow to include, well, almost everything. What are some of the real-world examples of this that are worrying U.S. policymakers right now?
The list is long and it's growing. Policymakers are worried about Chinese dominance in electric vehicles, for example, being weaponized, possibly through the massive amounts of data these cars collect user routes. Biometric info, you name it. It turns your car into a potential surveillance device.
And then there's the Internet of Things.
Yes, grave worries about Internet of Things, IoT devices, everything from your smart fridge to advanced farm equipment to consumer medical devices. The fear is they could give the Chinese Communist Party access to sensitive data right here on U.S. soil.
And this isn't just a data problem. It's about the physical hardware, too. It's trustworthiness, even for basic commercial tech.
Absolutely. We've seen American policymakers flag Chinese computer makers like Lenovo, which has a huge market share in the US. The concern is that they could potentially give the CCP access to sensitive personal and corporate data for millions of Americans just by building commercial laptops and servers.
When every device is a potential spy or a point of failure, the small yard just becomes unmanageable.
And this structural problem, this constant risk from MCF, leads to intense policy pressure for broader, more rigid restrictions.
From Congress, mainly.
Yes. We see calls for the Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, and we should pause and define BIS because it's the regulatory body that actually controls all of this.
The gatekeepers.
They are the gatekeepers. And there are calls for them to adopt a blanket presumption of denial for any export license application sending critical tech to any entity in the PRC.
A presumption of denial is the complete opposite of the current system, where denial has to be justified.
Exactly. It flips the burden of proof. Then Senator Marco Rubio, for instance, criticized the current regime as porous and ineffective. He argued that the U.S. can't afford to trust that any tech going to China won't ultimately serve the PLA. He said the government should stop standing by while the CCP uses its fusion strategy to steal tech and grow its military.
Okay, so that's the first reason the yard expands. What's the second?
The second is that these controls are increasingly used as broader foreign policy weapons. They often extend way beyond narrow military concerns to include things like geopolitical influence or human rights abuses.
So the entity list, the blacklist for foreign companies, isn't just about military tech anymore.
Not for a long time. The Trump administration initially put giants like Huawei and ZTE on the list for sanctions violations against Iran and North Korea. That's a broad foreign policy goal. The Biden administration added dozens of Chinese research institutes and firms for supporting Russia's military or for their activities in the South China Sea.
And we're also seeing the use of surveillance tech against the Uyghur people being used as a justification.
That's a very powerful driver of this expansion. Firms like Hikvision and Dahua, which are huge in video surveillance equipment, they were added to the entity list specifically for supporting the CCP's domestic surveillance and repression in Xinjiang. This shows how human rights concerns are now a major justification, broadening the scope far beyond just advanced chips and into general technology infrastructure.
And the third major pressure point is domestic politicization. This is where the whole security argument can get compromised because the controls are treated like bargaining chips in bigger negotiations. This is where the fence's credibility really takes a hit.
This is where the rubber really meets the road on the integrity of the whole strategy. We saw a stark reported example of this in 2025 under the second Trump administration. Export controls had been expanded to include American electronic design automation tools, that's the software used to design chips, and a specialized NVIDIA chip designed for China, the H20.
But then, just months later, the policy was reportedly reversed.
Temporarily reversed, yes.
Wait, if that's true, if the reversal on the NVIDIA H20 chip happened, doesn't that just prove that the entire high-fence strategy is ultimately subservient to short-term diplomatic or economic needs?
It creates enormous tension. The report suggested that sales of the H20 and the EDA tools were permitted again, only in exchange for China relaxing its own controls on critical minerals.
So it's a trade.
It's a trade. And if your core security objective is to deny China the means to build cutting-edge military AI, that goal is immediately undermined when the controls become negotiable items for economic concessions. It sends a message that the security rationale is transactional.
It shows the whole thing is vulnerable to being traded away for short-term gains. So ultimately, Jake Sullivan's effort to keep this small yard faces immense pressure from within, from the nature of the tech itself with MCF, and from the political temptations of leverage. The high fence is rarely static. It just seems to grow until it becomes a clumsy wall. Okay, so the assumption built into this whole fence strategy is that denial will significantly slow down China's development. But our sources make it really clear. China is not a passive victim here. They are demonstrating an immense capacity for both evasion and strategic adaptation.
Immense is the right word. China is proving to be far more capable at absorption and innovation than the Soviet Union ever was under COCOM. Their response has been multifaceted, starting with just, straight up evasion of the physical controls.
And evasion through the underground market seems like an intractable problem for regulators because the tech is so small and so valuable.
It's rampant and it's highly effective. Investigative journalists reported that over $1 billion in smuggled NVIDIA chips were moved to China in a recent period.
A $1 billion.
A billion. And the physical reality just works against the regulators. The chips can easily fit in a shoebox. This makes large-scale smuggling possible, even at the volume you'd need to build a modern supercomputer, which requires thousands of these chips. And the demand in the Chinese tech sector is just intense and barely concealed.
So if physical theft is headache number one for regulators, what's headache number two? The invisible supply chain.
I'd call it a three-pronged attack. Beyond the physical smuggling, you have state-backed efforts like intellectual property theft and recruitment. Western firms are constantly reporting theft of proprietary tech. ASML, for instance, announced that a former employee stole crucial information about its lithography technology and went back to China.
And that ties directly into the massive state investment they're making to indigenize this technology.
Absolutely. At the same time, Chinese giants like Huawei are aggressively recruiting top engineers and managers from the cutting-edge global firms. ASML, Applied Materials, Lam Research, they're offering incredibly lucrative packages to buy expertise, all supported by China's $50 billion big fund.
A big fund.
And that fund is dedicated explicitly to indigenizing critical equipment, especially SME and EG software. They are literally buying the expertise they can't currently create themselves.
And then there's the loophole that the U.S. administration had to scramble to close the ultimate invisible supply chain, the cloud.
The cloud loophole was the new frontier for evasion, especially for companies training large AI models. These models need massive computational power, and they rely on specialized memory called HBM, or high bandwidth memory, which allows for the massive data processing speeds you need.
So instead of buying the banned chips,
You just rent them. Chinese firms could simply rent access to the chips from cloud service providers like Amazon and Microsoft.
that's a brilliant form of regulatory arbitrage. The physical chip never crosses the border, but the computational power does.
Exactly. And as of 2023, this was, and I quote, totally legal. It allowed them massive high-speed access to the very computing power the U.S. was trying to deny. The Biden administration had to scramble to issue new restrictions because this one loophole threatened to make the entire chip export control policy obsolete overnight.
So how did the U.S. try to respond to that challenge?
They issued these Know Your Customer guidelines. They're basically expecting cloud computing firms to monitor and report their foreign clients' names and IP addresses. It's deputizing private industry to enforce foreign policy. But critics argue that the speed difference between the private sector and government regulation makes it really hard to enforce.
You mentioned that speed difference.
Yes. One industry analyst noted that the capacity of Chinese customers and the companies selling to them to find legal loopholes is, quote, infinite, and they don't take days off in that journey.
Whereas the government?
Whereas the U.S. government has shown it can do maybe one update per year to its regulations, the regulators are always playing catch-up to creative engineers.
So even if they can slow the evasion, China has shown this remarkable ability to adapt and indigenize technology far better than the Soviets ever could. They're adapting their production processes, even with older machines.
Absolutely. They are pushing machines that were never designed for cutting-edge results to their absolute limits. Take SMIC, China's top semiconductor manufacturer. They're cut off from ASML's most advanced EUV machines.
So what did they do?
They just boosted their imports of the less sophisticated deep ultraviolet or DUV lithography machines. Then they pushed these DUVs way past their intended limits and successfully manufactured 7-nanometer and even 5-nanometer chips. Now, they're still lagging behind the frontier. TSMC is at 3 nanometer and their yields are lower, which means more waste. But the technological achievement is undeniable, and it will only improve.
This is technological resilience under extreme pressure. We saw something similar with Huawei and 5G a few years back.
That's the classic case study in industrial resilience. After Huawei was put on the entity list and banned from importing cutting-edge chips, they had a choice: quit or adapt. They adapted. They rebuilt their 5G base stations using more mature, widely available 28-nanometer chips instead of the banned 7-nanometer chips. They used older tech to still achieve their strategic goals. It shows that denial just shifts the means. It doesn't necessarily stop the outcome.
And in the AI chip market, when the most advanced NVIDIA chips, the A100 and H100, were banned, China just bulk ordered the slightly less powerful compliant versions.
They immediately shifted their demand. Chinese firms started stockpiling the compliant versions, the A800 and H800s. They placed orders for over $5 billion worth of these chips. The controls create friction, they create costs, but they do not stop the flow of technology entirely.
So it's like the U.S. forced them to switch from using one modern freight train to using 3 less efficient locomotives to pull the same cargo. It's costlier, it's slower, but the cargo still gets there.
That is the perfect analogy. One AI expert estimated that a Chinese firm might need 3,000 H800s to get the same result that 1,000 H100s could achieve. It's undeniably more expensive, it uses way more electricity, it takes up more space. But as another expert commented, the Chinese are happy to do that. They prioritize indigenization and performance over immediate cost efficiency. They see this as a long-term investment in their technological sovereignty.
And the broader context here suggests that China really has the capacity to win this long game of self-reliance if they commit the resources. We've seen it in other industries.
Oh, their success in other key industries is a huge warning sign for Washington. Through dedicated industrial policy, the Chinese government achieved complete dominance in solar power. They now account for a staggering 80% of global solar cell exports.
And the same with EV batteries.
The same story. They dominate the EV battery industry, supplying 80% of the world's lithium-ion batteries. This history suggests that if Beijing commits the resources and the leadership, which they are doing with the big fund, they have a very high capacity for achieving self-reliance in advanced chips as well. And that makes the current high fence look like it might just be a temporary speed bump.
So the U.S. tech war is focused so heavily on silicon, but the sources show the American response is actually far broader. They're using a wide range of policy tools to restrict China's access to data, to capital, to global influence. The fragmentation of this effort is almost as striking as its scale. It's not just the Commerce Department. It's the FCC, the Treasury, Congress. They're all using every regulatory lever they have.
That's right. The toolkit extends into virtually every corner of the digital economy. It proves that Jake Sullivan's mission to secure American technological leadership requires restricting so much more than just chip exports. If technology is power, then controlling the flow of data and capital is just as essential.
So let's start with the non-chip parts of the digital world. Data and network infrastructure. What laws are being used there?
The U.S. has used existing laws, specifically the ICTS Supply Chain Security Rule. It cites a national emergency regarding foreign adversary ICTS, which is Information and Communications Technology Services.
And that rule gives the government broad authority.
Very broad. It lets them scrutinize and ultimately prohibit transactions involving foreign adversary communications tech. And it's been used to investigate operations like Alibaba's cloud business and the ride-sharing giant Didi.
But Congress has also passed specific bans that target certain companies and products no matter how they're used. This is where that fence really expands into normal commercial life.
Yes, the Secure Equipment Act is critical here. It compels the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, to virtually ban new electronics made by firms on the covered list. And this list includes those Chinese giants like Huawei, ZTE, Hikvision, and Dahua. It focuses on telecom and video surveillance equipment.
Which is a massive shift. It makes it almost impossible for them to introduce new products into the U.S. market.
Almost impossible. And perhaps even more expansive is a rule called Section 889.
Okay, explain what Section 889 means for a typical American business.
Section 889 was part of the National Defense Authorization Act, and it goes a big step further. It prohibits federal agencies, and this is the critical part, federal contractors, from even using that banned equipment, even if the use is completely unrelated to their government contract.
So hang on, if I'm a small engineering firm and I do even a tiny bit of business with, say, the Department of Defense, I suddenly can't have a Hikvision security camera in my own parking lot or a Huawei router in my non-classified office, even though my main business is commercial.
That's precisely it. It casts this huge compliance net over the entire defense industrial base and any company that wants a piece of the federal procurement pie. It makes the cost of having any of that banned Chinese equipment extraordinarily high for huge parts of the U.S. economy. It essentially forces American firms to choose a side. This is how the small yard just rapidly expands into the whole commercial sphere.
And the most public examples of this data threat involve popular apps, like TikTok.
Of course. The Trump administration tried to ban Chinese apps like TikTok and WeChat, and they cited these generalized threats of Chinese connected software applications, accessing personal devices, and potentially sending sensitive data back to the CCP.
And while those attempts were blocked in court.
They were, but they illustrate the broad power the executive branch claims to have to restrict almost any technology input, even based on a general threat that a foreign government could compel a private company to share user data. The perceived data threat is now just as important as the physical component threat.
Moving beyond the digital world, the financial flows access to American capital are also being restricted. It's like they're trying to starve the Chinese tech sector of U.S. investment and expertise.
Yes, the financial decoupling is very real, and it's quantifiable. It's largely driven by fear of U.S. regulatory scrutiny and just general geopolitical risk. U.S. investment in China is slowing way down. In 2023, only 45% of U.S. companies surveyed by AmCham China said they plan to increase their investment. That's the lowest number ever recorded.
And that's contributing to a big drop in foreign direct investment into China.
A continued decline, yes, after record lows in 2022, and we're seeing U.S. financial services companies themselves pulling back from direct joint ventures.
Like Vanguard.
Vanguard is a great example. They're reportedly preparing to exit their joint venture with Ant Group. And that's significant because it represents a withdrawal of sophisticated Western financial management and expertise. And critically, the CHEPS Act itself includes outbound investment restrictions. It prohibits firms that get U.S. assistance from materially expanding their semiconductor manufacturing capacity in China. That's a powerful financial chokehold on that one strategic sector.
But despite all these regulations, U.S. goods exports to China stayed surprisingly strong in 2023. This is where the whole decoupling narrative meets the hard reality of interdependence.
It's a very nuanced picture. U.S. exports, driven by strong Chinese demand for specific things like oil, aircraft parts, and biopharmaceuticals, they largely match the record amounts from 2022. So this trade shows that a full economic decoupling is highly unlikely, maybe impossible.
But the composition of trade has shifted.
It has. It's been actively shifting because of the tariffs imposed under the Trump administration's Section 301 investigation, which was a response to forced tech transfer and IP theft. So while overall trade is still massive, U.S. imports of those tariff products are shifting away from China-based suppliers and toward other countries in Southeast Asia. That is de-risking in action.
And China's response to all this pressure is to try and build an alternative financial universe, one that's less dependent on the U.S. dollar, which is the ultimate tool of American sanctions power.
Exactly. Beijing is acutely aware of the leverage the U.S. has through its sanctions power, especially after seeing the impact on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. So China is trying to weaken that power by internationalizing its currency, the renminbi or RMB. They've finalized deals with countries like Brazil and Saudi Arabia that allow for non-dollar settlement in their bilateral trade.
But the RMB is still only, 2.5% of global reserves? How can that small share make a difference in this competition?
It provides an essential alternative currency for states that are trying to get around U.S. sanctions. China leverages this by offering economic support to Russia and by deepening its trade networks with other sanctioned countries like Iran. This willingness to help international rule breakers sidestep U.S. sanctions, even with a small currency share, is a crucial example of how China is trying to bend the rules-based order in its favor and weaken the long-term effectiveness of the entire U.S. financial toolkit.
So this deep dive really shows that the U.S. tech war, which has been largely engineered by figures like Jake Sullivan, is so much more complex than just silicon. It's a massive, multi-domain conflict. It's being fought across military, economic, human rights, and financial spheres.
It is, but the effectiveness of the strategy, that high fence, is just severely impeded by these structural realities, China's deep global economic integration and its immense capacity for state-backed adaptation and evasion.
And the central dilemma for Washington, which was articulated in the Biden administration strategy, is trying to maintain this targeted approach. The scalpel, not the sledgehammer.
But the sources show that the reality of civil-military fusion and the desire to use these controls for broader foreign policy and human rights goals means that the high fence around a small yard is under constant pressure to grow larger, often chaotically. And that risks an uncontrolled decoupling that Washington swears it does not want. So if the U.S. strategy of denial is only successful in creating extreme friction, will these export controls merely serve to accelerate Beijing's resolve to fully indigenize advanced chips, SME, and AI? Could they ultimately succeed in the precise areas where they were blocked? If denial only serves to intensify the drive for self-reliance, the strategy of the fence may become self-defeating, turning a technological delay into a long-term technological separation, one that is ultimately controlled by Beijing.